Thanks to each of you for these wonderful talks. I thought I would begin by giving you maybe a chance to respond to one another if you'd like, or ask if there's anything you might want to ask each other, comment on. It would have been the first time some of you heard each other's talks, so that's okay. No, I'll start. No pressure. I thought that I would kind of open with a pretty broad question to begin to put these talks in dialogue with one another. To varying degrees, I would say all three of you are engaging the kind of discourse in the arts with that of maybe in different ways the sciences. For Sema, the kind of question of art practices with regards to authorship, but also through the discussion of agency. Through osmosis, or osmotic, the history of osmosis. Dan's sketch of the different qualities of the sciences and the arts, and Michael, I would say the interest across your work in especially vegetal processes of photosynthesis or biological regeneration. But here in this talk, through philosophy, the question of metabolism. So I wonder, as a way to start discussion, if any of you would care to elaborate on this turn to the sciences, or in Dan's case, maybe a turn from the sciences to the arts, as a way to think about the art object. And I think some of you already started to address this in your talks, but if one of the things that we might say defines artistic expression, and some of us may, of course, feel free to disagree, is its kind of impossibility to be reduced or explained through the sciences, right? Through processes of intuition, emotion, creativity, or the unconscious. What is invested in this kind of turn to the sciences or scientific terminology and discourse in this particular moment we might call the Anthropocene or something else? And maybe conversely, just to you, Dan, is there something, and I have a sense of what you might say after hearing your talk, but I'll ask it anyway. Is there something that linking up, for example, biological processes with artistic ones that might lend us actually new insights into the sciences? So that's just a kind of broad question about these two discourses. And then I'll open it up to all of you.
So, do you mind if I start? For me, the overriding concern is going to be chronological rather than transcendental, right? I'm sort of incapable of understanding what science and art are aside from their histories. And so for me, I think it is a really important moment in the history of both science and the history of art where they diverge and take different interests. And it's that divergence and the taking of different interests and ways of expressing and ways of knowing that I think has been mutually strengthening for both. As far as what, so to address, for example, what can biologists learn from art, so if there are any scientists in the room, I really apologize. But most of the time, as a historian of science who reads a lot of documents and writings and correspondence by scientists, I find scientists to be some of the most boring people ever. And the converse, artists are some of the most interesting people I've met. I mean, it's an interesting way that has developed, right? And so what I wanted to sort of end on was to say that I hope that artists can bring a larger vision of meaning, a larger vision of, I guess, articulation, if you want to use that word, to the sciences and to the scientists who, as I said, are intimately familiar with their research objects, but sometimes, or even often, to the expense of things that are not their research objects. So that's something else I guess I'll start with.
I would actually probably take issue with this fact that scientists are intimately familiar with their research objects, and this is a generalization, of course, it does not apply to all scientists, but if you look at plant sciences, where is the plant in plant sciences? The plant itself as a living being tends to disappear, and all you get is a collection of processes, biochemical exchanges, and all kinds of other processes that really don't require the form of a plant, right? So in a sense, you need to turn to an artist just to bring back the form of that which is studied, which has been deformed and deformalized to such an extent by science that the object itself disappears out of sight. In a sense, it is liberating that this happens, because then instead of these very determinate beings that we classify in certain tables of classification, that we box into certain identity categories, we get confluence of processes and functions that can be, and vectors of existence, I would even say more philosophically, that can be shared among different kinds of beings. So that's the liberating aspect of it. But the limiting aspect is that it is no longer clear that this work is actually done with the actual plants themselves, that what stands behind it is the plant. And I'm, of course, more familiar with what happens in the plant sciences. It is by far not a homogeneous field. There are these culture wars going on for years now in the plant science community between, on the one hand, the more traditional plant scientists who do not think that plants are intelligent beings and who think precisely that they are reducible to these very objective kind of processes, and to a small group of renegade plant scientists who defend this idea of plant intelligence and who want to think about a certain living subject behind their work, even though they are engaged in the same kind of framework of experimental design and so on. And so I think that to go back to this question of the collaboration between the sciences, the arts, and philosophy, I think it is really sorely needed today, and it's I really welcome such a collaboration, precisely because the division of labor that we find in capitalism has been advancing to such an extent, especially in the science world, where specialization has to be precise and sort of every time more and more minute. That to get a bigger picture, we need to put together a community of not just scientists but also artists and philosophers. So in my more optimistic moments, I envision the current moment as a replay of the Renaissance, when we could have a Leonardo who was all of these things in one. Clearly now such a thing would not be possible. So perhaps this collective, this community of interested of interested scientists, plants also, yes, of course, because once you recognize
I try
that
to dress up like a tree,
yeah.
so I feel you.
And that's the idea, that once there is this collaborative thinking, that maybe the subject, the non-human subject, such as a plant, would also be able to emerge and have its voice, for instance, as an intelligent being in its own right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think my project is much more reacting to hierarchies within the art world than to like science. Also, the title "Reading by Osmosis" is mainly symbolic and not really explaining anything about. I mean, Dan absolutely knows tons more about osmosis than when he was telling me I'm like a researcher of osmosis. I feel like, oh, this guy knows his shit. Yeah, so my it's like I think we all know, like kind of like we are living in a time that we feel like the agencies of non-humans are like letting themselves heard by a louder and louder voice, and it's just very hard for us to listen to that because we're not trained to that. We are like human-centered, etc. So for me, it's more kind of an experience. Like, how can you take maybe almost like an absurd perspective, like saying, okay, my dog is making an artwork, and like, okay, we can all acknowledge like art is like something we talk about within like human culture, so why would it make sense to do so? But I think it's like very important to kind of radically push yourself to do the absurd, just to kind of try, at least, you know, it's like in the trying of taking the other position to get out of your own vantage point. So.
Thanks. Shall we open it up to the audience?
Hello, hi. So thank you for posing the problem so nicely, because I think that's the value of our meeting and thinking together. And let me just add to this scheme a certain question posed by Maurice Blanchot in the space of literature, when he says about writing, but art in general as well, that it's not so much about looking or relating to the other world, to the world or to a possible other world, but to the other of all worlds in this way. The other of all worlds. So for me, it seems like art has its own concern, which is this other of all worlds, which I'm not sure, because I know very little about nature, finally, in this way. What I'm sure of is that not every human being is also relating to the other of all worlds. You can perfectly live your life without having this concern. Therefore, that's the question I offer to you. Do you, in your thinking, do you recognize something that resembles the Blanchotian kind of stake of art, which is this other of all worlds?
Well, I think like the other is also already within ourselves. So I think that's also the thing of collaboration. It's like we are already collaborating with all like bacteria in our stomach and the input that. So we are already like beings of collaboration. So if I would talk about like the other would be like as much in us as outside. But I don't know if you.
Yeah, I guess I would be, I'm liking the context of this quote from Blanchot and the relation to the other of all worlds, but it would seem to me to point in two possible directions. One would be worldlessness, a kind of, and Blanchot is a thinker of the disaster, right? And so insofar as we're maybe collectively moving toward the biggest disaster ever, at least for the human species, but also for all the other species that are becoming extinct, then it imposes a kind of ethical imperative upon art to relate to the other of all worlds. On the other hand, the other of all worlds would just be maybe something like the creator, so that would be the theological take on it, the one who is before the world, because we have to remember that when we use this term world, we think in a very secular kind of way. It does have a theological prehistory to it, right? The world is precisely that. The worldly domain is the secular domain, that which is mundane and which is not holy, right? There is a kind of shadow of the theological also behind it. But this is just a speculation, because I'm not sure exactly in which context Blanchot is using this expression.
I can only guess at what you're asking, because this is not anywhere close to my areas of expertise. So historians of science, especially about 20 years ago, became very interested in the social history of objectivity, right? This idea that science and the scientist is supposed to let the phenomenon stand for itself, and which has a very specific history. It's a discourse that develops in a very specific time and place in the sciences. And one of the questions, it still is, and I think this is one of the historical questions that's still unresolved, is objectivity, or the discourse or stance of being an objective scientist, is objectivity fundamentally a retreat from the activity of science, right? Are you saying that I'm trying to pull myself out of the analysis in order to let the phenomenon stand by itself? Which was the position taken by Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison in their famous articles and books about objectivity. Or is it instead a confidence that the technical apparatus being developed can do something the scientist cannot, which is Ted Porter's argument in his history of statistics. Right, so is it a withdrawal of the scientist in a retreat, or is it full confidence of the scientist in letting other assemblages or other technologies reveal the world? I'm sort of guessing here, right? This is unclear. I think it would depend on the scientist that you ask, and I think it depends on the kinds of sciences you look at. I think I'll leave that at that.
Thank you. I think we were supposed to stand up because the other person stood up. Thank you for these interesting thoughts you presented. I have a question to Sema Bekirovic. You were saying all these things like the octopus is making a film and showing us its world, and the rain is doing this, and the moss is doing that, and the moss is reclaiming. Of course, that's all nonsense, because, or to put it in kinder words, it's a fiction. It's an absurd fiction, and it's also very anthropocentric fiction, because it's like projecting like the way we humans conceive of the world with intentionality, and we want to show our world to other beings. It's projecting all this on non-human beings. But I know that you know all that. So my question is, and it's really not a rhetorical question, but a sincere question: why are you doing this? Why are you saying all these things? And I have one suspicion. But tell me if I'm on the right trail.
Okay.
I have one suspicion, which is because it made me think. Yeah, we say all these things about human artists. Picasso painted that painting. Which, the more we think of it, like, you know, mentioning ANT and stuff like that, the more we think of it, it's just as absurd. It's just as absurd to say that because, but this is one of the suspicions I have. Is this where you're going? And what are maybe your other motivations you might have to tell us these fictions?
Yeah. So I mean, I think also clear in my talk, like one of the inspirations is like neuroscience, like research into the free will, and like how absurd it is that we kind of call some people like genius, or having this kind of super hierarchical system of art and artists, and how it is the whole goal of the project is to more ridicule us than to make another hierarchy where I say like, yeah, but now the rain should get the Turner Prize. So obviously that's not my intention, although that would be great. But I'm like my intention is mostly that, I mean, I do something super anthropocentric actually to show that we are doing this all the time. We are in a quite aggressive way pushing our logic into the natural world and not really like opening ourselves or listening to other kind of agencies. And it's kind of pushing, it is a bit of a thought experience, but it's serious nonetheless also. Yeah, it's both.
Hello, thank you. Do I have to stand? Maybe. I'm both a scientist and an artist, so I'm going to try and tap into the more interesting side of my being.
Sorry.
But, I'm just kidding. But just following up from that, because this idea of intention also stuck out when I was listening to your talk, Sema, because also some of the works look like, you know, sort of disarticulations or sort of these kind of composting works rather than synthesis. And I mean, of course, there are different ways of thinking about art in those ways as well, in those terms as well. But then, of course, that it made Michael's talk was really interesting in that he brought up precisely this concept of articulation, disarticulation, and metabolism, which is also another way to think about how art transforms material. And I was just thinking then about this question and why are we interested in this idea of agency? And then it reminded me of to come back to what Michael was talking about in terms of plant science and art and the kind of thinking that's happening around there. There was a term that Natasha Myers used when she was talking about the phytoscene, which is like her way of thinking about how plants have transformed on a planetary scale, you know, atmosphere and beyond. She had this term, which I think she called agencies of rearrangement. And maybe that's potentially why it's useful to think about non-human transformations, because we are at a time when we have to think about these kind of planetary scale transformations that are happening and agencies within that. So maybe that's also a way of thinking through this particular question. And I wondered if that was something that is useful for thinking about non-human agency or intention.
Yes, I think I would absolutely agree with you on this question of the agencies of rearrangement. And to go back to the question of planetary metabolism, the idea would be precisely to view all of these artworks not as the outcomes, the final products of a certain intention that preceded them, right? Which is this idealist way in which we view human-made art, right? There's a kind of plan that I concoct in my mind, and then I think about how the best way to make this sculpture or to draw this painting, and then I use the materials as mere means to implement my idea in the world, right? But here we get a kind of, in this notion also of the agencies of rearrangement, we get a mix of the ideal and the material somehow, right? A kind of transformation that is in the process of becoming, so that it's not a final product. Sema, by sort of taking these things out of the context where they were made, is freezing for a moment the process of their metabolism, of their transformation, and showing us this fleeting moment that is almost always already lost, right? And then we can imagine what would happen to this disco ball if it were to stay for 30 years more, or 300 years more, and so on, right? But so these are like snapshots of the of a vanishing present of a metabolism, of this rearrangement that becoming that never has a final end goal in sight, in that sense, right? And I think that would be also the main difference from it's not just a mocking of the human-made art, but it radically questions the beginning and the end point, right? Mm-hmm. That are so clear in human artistic practices.
Yeah, and showing like they're all collaborations, and they're all like it's always like in the objects that I've that are in the book. They're always like a fusion of different worlds. They're not like only like a plant only interacting with itself, but showing like all the different processes are always like acting and processing together. Yeah. So.
I have some discombobulated thoughts about this. So one immediate thought is that to speak of planetary metabolism, to speak of the phytoscene, I'm going to admit I'm more familiar with Natasha Myers' work on X-ray crystallography, as opposed to her more recent work on plants. But one of the things that strikes me about speaking in such global ways is that this is for the sciences, this is the ultimate abstraction of plantness, or of the plant, right? We're no longer talking about a specific kind of terrestrial plant. We're no longer talking about a species of plant or a class or a genus. We're talking about plants as a whole, and probably lumping in together things that are no longer classified as plants but classified as algae. And it's a kind of thinking that's aided by an abstraction, by the kinds of abstractions of plant metabolism that ecologists are really expert at, right? I mean, this is the, if you want to talk about the abstraction of the plant and the, of plants in the plant sciences, I would actually say that the plant scientists are very familiar with plants because they're handling plants all the time to do their research. But an ecologist typically has to sit at a computer and process specimens that are coded by undergraduates and graduate students, typically, to taking readings from machines that are machines and sensors that are located around the world or in a particular forest site. So I would say that there is something extraordinarily abstracted about that that I find not troubling. I'm not troubled by it. I find it an interesting way to operate scientifically. That's one thought I have. The second thought I had is maybe picking up on, was there a part about intentionality in your question?
Yeah, began with this idea of the intention that Sema had raised as one of the concepts in her talk.
Right. So when Sema said that intention or intentionality is a very difficult thing to deal with, I would say, for me at least, yeah, intentionality as such is kind of a hard concept to deal with, but in a given situation, I feel like I understand what an intention is, right? If we take the macaque example, which I think is a beautiful one, I think from the reports that we have, we're pretty sure the macaques intended to push buttons and intended to enjoy the object or do something that they wanted to do with this object, the camera. Did they intend to take a picture? I would question whether taking a picture is a concept that's known to a macaque, right? Taking a picture by itself as an artistic practice, right, is something that we're so automatically intuited to now with, I have a camera in my pocket right now. But in order for that intention to have manifested to begin with, there had to be an intention of, in the 19th century, designing a film emulsion, of designing a lens. There had to be an intention now of using photolithography to etch a silicon chip that is sensitive to light in certain ways and a whole set of algorithms and processes in order to read what that chip sees, right? All of those intentions are meant to capture images or take pictures. And it is not clear to me if, well, actually, I'll just say, I don't think the macaque has that in mind when it's pushing buttons. I think the photographer has that in mind when it puts the camera there. Now,
if you take, it depends on which concept of art you are looking at. So if you take someone like Schiller, with his notion of art as free play, right, of imagination or free play of your capacities, which is actually much more reflected in the German word for art, in Kunst, this play of capacities, of capabilities, then precisely an automatic intention to take a picture would not be art. This automatic knowing that by clicking you would take a picture, it is not art because it is completely predetermined. It's free of playfulness, right? It is only when you start playing without a purpose in mind, for instance, right? If art is a free play, then something unexpected happens, and that event, that unexpected kind of occurrence is art. So
I don't think Schiller had cameras.
No, but he did understand something about mechanical causality, as opposed to something that breaks with that kind of mechanical predetermined notion of causality, right?
I object fundamentally to the idea that my taking a picture is predetermined, right? I mean, so I'm not talking about the mechanics of the camera, right? I'm talking about what is captured, right? Yeah.
I just wanted to follow up on your sense that you're especially interested in collisions of worlds or composites, and another account of aesthetic experience predominantly of the work of art, as well as Kant's sense of free play. And he's not at all hesitant to use natural examples, to talk about forests or oceans, and talking about the beautiful or the sublime. So I wonder first how you come to privilege these composites where there seems to be some interaction between a human artifact and a natural, some interaction between, should I do that briefly again? I think I can do it very quickly. Sorry about that. So Kant's sense, Kant's privileging often of natural phenomena in his account of aesthetic experience. Given that, why are you as interested as you are in composites where natural processes and human artifacts seem to be interacting? Can natural objects in themselves be beautiful for you? And a second question, or works of art in this same sense. And the second related question is, are all of these necessarily and only works of art to us? Or is there a wider context of aesthetic recognition in the natural world that might see them?
Thank you. Well, I'm mainly interested in these composites because historically humans have interpreted nature, and I just wanted to show that everything we make is not an end point. It's all the time being reused and remade, and although I understand like interpretation sounds it's like a conscious interaction, but if you think of like all these different processes, they have they rework our stuff, and they all do it with our very specific skill set. Like a Moss is taking over football in a very specific way. I mean, next to the whole conscious or not conscious, because I think it will be like a evening-long story from talking microbes, DNA to, I mean, it's a very, I think I'm also not maybe the best person to have that discussion, but in general, I just wanted to show like all these different forces, they have these specific ways of doing things, and from this specific way comes a specific aesthetics. And how do we relate to that aesthetic? So, it was just for me to kind of not to say like, things just decays. Like, I mean, we know things just decay, but things decay in a specific way, in a way where different materials, they get in dialogue with each other, like not like conscious dialogue, but like it is a happening between different materials. And I thought it was more clear to show that with stuff that we know from our own cultural world, because we kind of see these objects as kind of set shapes, like kind of endpoints. But obviously, these are also temporary manifestations of objects. And in these different worlds kind of acting on each other, a lot of things happen that you could see as creative, or it's not like all kind of logic, deterministic happening of things, but it's just like things making a thing, together in a way. I don't know. It's really hard. It's for me hard to explain. And if this is like appreciated as art by non-humans, like for example, with the crows, I think there's an aesthetic perception probably there. I think that's probably not the case with, for example, the wind. But for me that's not so very important. So it's more reflecting on like how we appreciate things. And if we say like an artist has a specific handwriting, I could also say like, but Moss has a handwriting too, in a way,
Thanks a lot. I would have a question to you, Sema. I still try to wrap my head around the idea you presented. I find it very fascinating, although apparently it seems that we can't escape this human vantage point. So in terms of, you could call it aesthetic experience, objet trouvé, whatever. What I would be interested in is how do the objects, the things you found, how do they curate? So did they curate? Was there a certain agency in curating? Did they, and I'm hesitating to say this, but did they, let's not say talk to you, did they communicate to you? What was the curational logic, if we can use the word logic?
Well, I had a few more kind of parameters, in the sense that I was just trying to find as different kind of processes as I could think of that are reacting on man-made objects. And that was actually much harder than I thought. So it was, I slowly extended these different fields. But there was like a lot of repetition, because there's like tons of stuff made out of metal that you can find in the Thames River, for example. And there's just hardly any nests made of like funky objects. So I tried to kind of, in my whole selection, in my whole process, just to kind of open up like in all these possible different ways, and then mainly just not have too many double. I wanted everything to show like a specific kind of relationship between process and object. So that was kind of the selection. Yeah.
May I add something? Just in reflecting on this question and Sema, your answer. It is that it's very hard for us typically to avoid anthropomorphic language in order to describe the interaction. Right. One of the ways in the sciences, the attempt at objectivity is usually achieved through the proliferation of arcane technical terms, terms that we would never use to describe ourselves. Whether that's I doubt anyone would call that non-anthropocentric, but it's certainly an attempt to be less anthropomorphic.
Okay, thank you all for your talks. I mostly have a question for Sema, but anyone's welcome to answer. I like the discourse around sort of taking the human away from center stage, but I just wonder, in this context, what kind of object or process would you consider not to be art? Like where do you draw the line? Because I'm not really able to formulate an example of something that couldn't be put in your exhibition.
Like general, I don't have a concept about what art is. I'm sorry, I would not make this. But for the project, it was really for me about like how about like value systems, like how stuff that we value as people is valued by non-humans, and then like I mean, again, like I realized that the wind is probably not valuing anything, but in like, for example, plants or animals, they have like preferences of doing things. And in extension to that, it's just like also kind of this realization, like these things that we have, they only have value as long as we are here to value them, and it's connected to our own mortality in many ways. And I think that also shows in these objects. Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if, like, another way of putting the question is, are the pair of shoes without the moss on them considered a piece of art? Probably not the same. Probably not an object you would choose. Or are the hangers hanging in the closet? Right. There's something I think about the kind of the discarded nature, or the kind of absence or evacuation of the kind of human, or its kind of function or use value. Something about this relationship, I think maybe that makes it interesting for you. Maybe not.
Yeah, I think in general you can, of course, call everything art or not, and in the end you end up in this game of naming and appropriating. And yeah, that was not really my goal. My goal was much more to kind of, if we as a look at this and kind of imagine it could be forms of creativity. How do we reflect to that as human beings? It's more,
I think in line with this framework that I schematically presented in my remarks, you could say that anything that is articulated is already art. But as I mentioned toward the end of my remarks, the peculiar potential of art for me is awakened where there are sudden leaps from one regime of articulation to the other. When things that seem to be just purely extended all of a sudden express something to us, or when expression passes into the articulation that is a kind of spatial jointure, right? So in these leaps, in this less expected or unexpected leaps from one kind of articulation to another, that's where I would locate the more specific kind of power of art, in a sense. Yeah.
I would say whatever you put in an art museum, just functionally, because it's when you put the object in the art museum that
very old-fashioned.
I know, isn't it? Or whatever you hang up, on your wall, or whatever you put on a pedestal, or whatever you circumscribe in a space where you do this kind of reflection that Michael is suggesting that we do, right? I mean, so I know this is sure, it's a terrible answer, right? But my motivation in giving that answer is to try to avoid falling into the trap of this absolutist transcendental concept of art that must be defined a priori before we put it in a museum.
Join me in thanking them, and please join us upstairs.